Hello again, fellow history buffs. Welcome back to Old News, the podcast that lets you relive the past, 1 year at a time. Today, we're diving into 1948, a year of significant political and scientific turning points. Let's begin with the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But first, we must take a step back to the events that led up to it. Zionism, the political and cultural movement advocating for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, had been growing since the late 19th century. It emerged as a response to centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe, where Jews faced persecution, discrimination, and violence. Jewish thinkers and leaders, like Theodor Herzl, envisioned a return to the biblical homeland as a solution to these dangers and a way to revive Jewish cultural and national identity. While Zionism draws inspiration from the Bible, citing Abraham's covenant, prophetic promises of return from exile, and the centrality of Jerusalem, these texts are primarily spiritual, cultural, or symbolic, rather than political mandates. Key biblical passages, such as Genesis 12-17, Isaiah 11, and Psalm 137, reflect longing for the land and cultural identity, but do not prescribe sovereignty. Religious Zionists interpret them as divine endorsement of modern statehood, whereas secular Zionists see them as historical or emotional justification. And modern Zionism was becoming a nationalist movement. Meanwhile, the land known as Palestine had been inhabited for centuries by a majority Arab population, primarily Muslim, but also including Christian and Jewish communities. Palestinians had developed their own deep historical, cultural, and social ties to the land, living in villages and cities across the region. They saw themselves as the indigenous people of the territory, with claims to self-determination and sovereignty. The competing national aspirations of Jews and Arabs in Palestine intensified during the early 20th century. After World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate to govern Palestine, with the Balfour Declaration of 1917 as a guiding policy. The declaration expressed British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also stating that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. However, this ambiguous language led to increasing tensions and violence between Jewish immigrants and the Arab population, who felt marginalized and threatened by the growing Jewish presence. After the horrors of the Holocaust, which claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, global support for a Jewish state surged. In November 1947, the United Nations voted to adopt Resolution 181, also known as the UN Partition Plan. The plan proposed dividing Palestine into 2 independent states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem to be placed under international administration. The Jewish leadership reluctantly accepted the plan, viewing it as a legitimate path to statehood, though they were disappointed by the proposed borders. The Arab leadership in Palestine and surrounding Arab states outright rejected it, arguing that it violated the rights of the Arab majority and was imposed without their consent. Violence broke out almost immediately. What began as intercommunal clashes between Jewish and Arab militias quickly escalated into a full-scale civil war within the British Mandate. Between December 1947 and May 1948, both sides committed attacks, reprisals, and massacres, as neighborhoods, towns, and roads became battlegrounds. Jewish paramilitary groups like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi carried out operations to secure territory for the future Jewish state, while Arab militias and volunteer fighters attacked Jewish settlements and convoys. One of the most infamous incidents during this period was the Deir Yassin massacre in April 1948, where over 100 Palestinian villagers were killed by Israeli Irgun and Lehi forces, fueling fear and panic among the Arab population. By the spring of 1948, the British were preparing to withdraw, exhausted and increasingly unable to control the deteriorating situation. Many Arab residents began fleeing or were expelled from their towns and villages, setting the stage for the broader refugee crisis to come. That momentum culminated on May 14, 1948, when David Ben-Gurion, a longtime Zionist leader and Polish-born immigrant to Palestine, stood before a crowd in Tel Aviv and declared independence with the creation of the State of Israel. The declaration came just as British colonial rule in Palestine ended. Often called the father of modern Israel, Ben-Gurion became the new nation's first prime minister and defense minister, guiding it through its most fragile and dangerous beginning. Harry S. Truman, then President of the United States, recognized Israel de facto within minutes of the declaration, making the U.S. the first country to do so. Then just hours after the declaration, 5 nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded, rejecting the United Nations partition plan and the legitimacy of the Jewish state. The war that followed, known in Israel as the War of Independence and among Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe, was brutal and chaotic. Though initially outgunned and outnumbered, Israel's newly formed defense forces managed to hold their ground and ultimately expanded their territory beyond what had been granted in the UN plan. The war lasted into 1949 and resulted in an estimated 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fleeing or being expelled from their homes, many of whom became permanent refugees. By war's end, Israel controlled about 77% of historic Palestine. The West Bank came under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt. But no formal peace was signed, just armistice agreements. The lines were drawn, but the conflict was far from over. The roots of this conflict lie in the competing national movements and historical claims of two peoples deeply connected to the same land, a complexity that continues to challenge efforts toward peace today. Also in Europe, the Cold War heated up. The Berlin Blockade, begun in mid-1948 by the Soviet Union, was an attempt to cut off Allied access to West Berlin. In response, the US and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation that began in June and would continue through most of 1949. At its height, planes were landing in Berlin every 30 seconds, delivering food, fuel, and hope to a city on the front lines of a divided world. Domestically, 1948 marked a civil rights turning point. In July, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. military. It was a landmark moment that faced strong resistance, but signaled the federal government's increasing role in the civil rights struggle. That same year, Alice Coachman became the first black woman to win an Olympic gold medal, capturing the high jump at the London Summer Olympics and breaking barriers in international sport. These Olympics were significant, the first after a 12-year hiatus due to World War II. The austerity games, as they were called, had no frills and no new stadiums, but they were rich in spirit and symbolism. It was a powerful reminder of the world's desire to move forward and rebuild through peaceful competition. Native Americans also took a step forward with changes in U.S. law, which clarified their voting rights. While many indigenous people had been granted U.S. citizenship through the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, individual states continued to block their right to vote through legal loopholes, literacy tests, residency requirements, and claims that Native people living on reservations were not state residents. In 1948, two landmark state court decisions in Arizona and New Mexico ruled that these restrictions were unconstitutional. The cases were brought by Native American veterans who had served in World War II, but were denied the right to vote in their home states. The courts found that this violated the Constitution, affirming that Indigenous citizens had the same voting rights as others. These rulings were significant milestones in the fight for civil rights, though full access to the ballot box would remain uneven for decades due to continued voter suppression tactics. Then in the fall of 1948, President Truman pulled off one of the greatest political upsets in American history. Virtually every poll, newspaper, and political expert predicted a loss to Republican challenger Thomas E. Dewey. But on election night, Truman defied the odds and won re-election for a full term, securing a dramatic comeback with his signature blunt style, plain-spoken confidence, and whistle-stop campaign. His now famous victory, held aloft in a photo holding the premature headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." Truman's win came despite internal fractures within the Democratic Party. Strom Thurmond ran a segregationist campaign under the state's Rights Democratic Party, or Dixiecrats, while former Vice President Henry Wallace led a progressive third-party campaign. But neither split managed to derail Truman's broad appeal to working-class voters, and the internationally used centigrade temperature scale was officially renamed Celsius by the Ninth General Conference on Weights and Measures. The scale, which defines 0 degrees as the freezing point of water and 100 degrees as the boiling point under standard atmospheric pressure, had been widely used since the 18th century. However, the name centigrade caused confusion because it also referred to a unit of angular measurement. 1 centigrade equals 1/100th of a right angle. To eliminate ambiguity and to honor the Swedish astronomer Anders Celsius, who first proposed a version of the scale in 1742, originally with reversed values, the scientific community adopted degrees Celsius as the official term. This decision reflected the broader post-war movement toward global standardization in science and measurement, particularly within the metric system. Since then, Celsius has remained the primary temperature scale used in science and by most countries around the world. In literature, T.S. Eliot won the Nobel Prize for revolutionizing modern poetry. His works like The Wasteland and Four Quartets profoundly expressed modern spiritual crisis and renewal, blending innovation, tradition, and philosophical depth to shape 20th century literature and restore moral seriousness to modern art. And Alan Paton's novel, Cry the Beloved Country, offered a searing look at racial injustice in South Africa, foreshadowing the apartheid regime that would formally take hold that same year. Indeed, in 1948, the National Party won the general election in South Africa and began enacting the official policy of apartheid, codifying racial segregation into law and setting off decades of resistance and global condemnation. In entertainment, Alfred Hitchcock released Rope, his first film in color and a technical marvel designed to appear as one continuous shot. And in animation, a new voice joined the Looney Tunes roster. Yosemite Sam, the hot-headed cowboy, made his debut. In music, the sounds of bebop were echoing through smoky clubs, with artists like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie pushing jazz into exciting experimental territory. Perry Como and Dinah Shore dominated the pop charts, while a young Hank Williams was beginning to make waves in country music. And in sports, the Cleveland Indians won its last World Series, at least for a long time, defeating the Boston Braves in 6 games. In the NFL, the Philadelphia Eagles claimed the championship, played in a blizzard, with a shutout win over the Chicago Cardinals, a rematch from the year before. For a little more interesting history on the Cardinals, they were one of the founding charter teams of the NFL in 1920. But after struggling attendance behind the more popular Chicago Bears, they moved to St. Louis in 1960, then to Phoenix, Arizona in 1988. So that's it for Old News, year 1948. In the words of Winston Churchill, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.